this is as evident already. This is on imperialism and climate change. And just to give the context, the background, we know that from our the IPCC reports, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports, this was the report from April and then subsequently July. What we do know is that climate change is already very significant. It's already causing substantial damage and loss, and that all our natural systems and ecosystems are under threat. The land, water, ocean, marine, everything is under threat. And we know that these effects are significantly larger than was anticipated earlier. In other words, every IPCC report says that things are much worse than we thought they would be even a few months ago. And what this means is that we are seeing major shifts in climate across the world. We are seeing extreme weather events. We are seeing significantly increased danger of major loss and damage, and general deterioration. Even when it's not an extreme event, there is desertification, there's long-term deterioration of the soils, and there's all kinds of other issues, shifts in the rivers, and so on. We also know that there are some already irreversible losses. Species extinctions, for example. We've had the largest number of species extinctions over the last decade ever in recorded history. And there are many other impacts that are close to irreversible, like the hydrological changes that happen when glaciers melt, or because of some mountain and Arctic ecosystems that are thawing, and thereby changing the course of rivers and doing all kinds of other effects. And these will in turn have implications for the Gulf Stream, for different things that have made our planet livable or that human beings had adjusted to and nature on the planet had adjusted to. All of these things are now likely to change. There are tipping points. We don't know the extent of the change with the tipping points. And of course, all of this has very significant consequences and impacts on physical and mental health, especially in low and middle income countries. And we know that there are already significant humanitarian crises occurring, again, in low and middle income countries, because the climate hazards interact with very high vulnerability. What the IPCC reports also tell us is that adaptation is, again, another source of inequality. There are very large adaptation gaps across different kinds of countries, whether you're a rich country, poor country, the region you're in, the areas within countries, the categories of people within countries. As usual, the marginalized are the worst off. Those who are already poor, already deprived, already subject to discrimination of various kinds have tended to be those also the most vulnerable. And that in turn has meant that adaptation itself has been associated with growing inequality. But also, the IPCC reports point to something interesting and different, which is maladaptation. That is to say, attempts to adapt which actually make things worse and add to inequality. They give some examples. They mention when you try and suppress fires in ecosystems that were naturally fire adapted, but the intensity or the frequency of the fires has gone up. As you try and suppress those, you actually make things worse. When you build seawalls or hard defenses against flooding, you can actually, again, make things worse. When places get warmer and therefore you rush to install more air conditioning, you're adding to the global warming. So maladaptation is also becoming more of a problem. This is the context in which I want to look at climate imperialism. So let me first state what I mean by climate imperialism. Incidentally, there is an article, for those of you who are interested, there's an article in the Monthly Review with Debamanyu Das and Shobhik Chakravarti and I have written, which is essentially on this. And I'm defining imperialism here as the struggle of large monopolistic capital over economic territory when it is actively aided and assisted by states. So this is a broader definition of imperialism than is often thought of. It's not necessarily associated with political control or colonialism, and it can take many different forms because the economic territory that is being contested, the struggle over that economic territory itself can take many forms. So, of course, there's land, and everybody knows about the significance of land in any imperial control and struggle. But there are also the resources extracted from nature. There's labor, the extent to which you can access both paid and unpaid labor, and the terms on which you can exploit it. It's access to markets. It's the creation of new markets in the form of commoditized services that were earlier mainly delivered by public provision. Everything from electricity to education to security. These are all things that were seen as the domain of public provision and now increasingly are privatized. Again, new commodities like knowledge itself, intellectual property, we call it today, which is again hotly contested and is a major instrument of imperial control. Cyberspace, the digital world, and just the ability to access and to have connectivity and the control over that connectivity. All of these are subject to imperialist contestation. And of course, one of the crucial aspects, I would argue, in this current neoliberal phase is that of the environmental interaction with the planet. This is increasingly one of the aspects of imperialism that is most strongly associated with coercion, conflict, and wars. And of course, with all the legal and economic architecture that frames imperialism, which appears to be less coercive, but actually is often just as significant and constraining. So the problem with the reason why we have climate imperialism is because, in fact, the way we're addressing the problem is inherently problematic. It's inherently wrong because climate is global, right? I mean, the climate doesn't recognize visas and passports and national borders. And so you would think that attempts to deal with climate would also similarly be global. But instead, we actually still deal with it nationally. And we come with different nations making commitments. So how does it work? Well, countries are assigned a particular climate responsibility, which is based on their current carbon emissions. Now, remember, it's the current carbon emissions that are being considered. And then these form the basis of the negotiations and the national commitments, COP26 in Glasgow, recently COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. Of course, the fact that you're looking at current emissions ignores historic responsibility, the carbon debt, and that understates the responsibility of richer countries, which were more responsible, as I will show you. Also, typically, this relies on using the purchasing power parity measures of GDP for comparing across countries. This is something done in all international comparisons today. The IMF and the World Bank use it, the World Bank especially for the international poverty line. The WTO uses it. Everybody uses purchasing power parity GDP measures, which are a problem at many levels, and I could give you a whole different lecture on that. But one of the most significant things is that it overstates the incomes of poorer countries. It exaggerates the incomes of poorer countries. And therefore, they are typically given more responsibility than they should be getting. The measures of carbon emissions, in turn, are production-based rather than consumption-based. And that underplays the significance of consumption in the North because, of course, the North tends to export a lot of its emissions. That is to say, it imports some of the more carbon-intensive forms of commodities produced with more carbon-intensive production. And that enables it to consume more directly and indirectly, to consume more of the carbon emissions than it actually has to take the responsibility for. So when you use these current production-based carbon emissions, then you tend to blame certain countries. And of course, the big villains of the piece in the latest COPs in Glasgow and Egypt have been China and India, which have emerged as major emitters. But just to look at the historical debt, developed countries of today, 14% of global population, are responsible for nearly 80% of the cumulative carbon emissions over 1.5 centuries, so between 1850 and 2011. Now you can say, wait a minute, in 1850 or in the 19th century, or even in most of the 20th century, nobody knew that carbon emissions was a problem. You can't blame all our predecessors and ancestors for things that nobody knew about, that people were not conscious that carbon emission is a big problem and you have to contain it and you have to worry about it. So it's not fair to just blame the past. But it turns out that more than half of these historical emissions occurred just in the last 30 years, when everyone knew that climate change is a problem, that CO2 emissions is hugely responsible. I mean, everyone knows. Now we have data on the archives of the government in the US and Europe. Everyone knew that this was a problem. Scientists knew, governments knew. And yet more than half of the emissions have occurred in that period, when you could have done a lot more to prevent and mitigate the climate change. So let's look first at these different methods of determining carbon emissions. There is the production-based method, where the responsibility is placed on whoever produces the goods and services within a location. So it's all about production. What is striking is that China has dramatically increased. Between 2000, when it was significantly lower than the United States, it was the second largest, but still significantly lower. The blue lines are for the year 2000, the orange lines are for 2019. In those 2 decades, China dramatically, almost nearly 3 times, increases its carbon emissions and becomes far and away the highest emitter. The United States, then the second largest emitter. India, again, a very, very significant increase. So it's now the 3rd largest emitter, when it was, really about 5th or 6th earlier. Russia, the other large emitter, but really because it is a hydrocarbon exporter. Okay, so these are really the big changes in terms of emissions by production, total emissions. But of course, in terms of per capita carbon emissions by production, it's quite different. Here, US is definitely among the highest. The United States, Saudi Arabia, and Australia are the highest. And all 3 are fossil fuel or mineral producers. Okay, remember, so that makes a big difference. China, less than half of these. And India, 1/8 of these, okay? Only 2 metric tons per capita, the same as Indonesia and Brazil. So it's and of course here the rich countries, Japan, Korea, they are much more significant in terms of the per capita emissions. But of course, when I've spoken earlier about the difference between production-based and consumption-based emissions, that's really because international trade continues to play a big role. So here you have the orange bars, which is emissions based on final demand, okay? And the blue bars are emissions based on production. This is data from the OECD relating to 2015. And as you can see, the million metric tons, the difference between the orange and blue bars is the gray bars. And if the gray bars are negative, that tells you that these are countries that are importing more carbon intensive goods. And so they're kind of, if you like, exporting the emissions. They're getting other people to do the dirty work for them. The United States is the biggest in this one. It's 775 million metric tons in 2015. Japan, also very large, basically all the rich countries, right? Italy, Germany, France, UK, all showing positive balance. This set of countries has been chosen because together they account for around 2/3 of all global emissions. So when we're looking at this, we're really looking at the bulk of global emissions. And here, then the BRICS countries show a very different pattern, okay? So all of them show a positive balance. That is to say, they are producing stuff that creates more emissions than they are consuming, okay? And so this positive balance is huge. In the case of China, it's 1,302 or 1,303 million tons. But it's also positive for Russia, India, South Africa. So in a sense, global trade has also been driving a lot of the carbon emissions. And so when you're looking at per capita emissions by final demand, you get a completely different picture, even from the production-based per capita. Here, the US is far and away the highest emitter, okay, at 18 metric tons per person. Compared to India, it's only 1.5, okay? So really very, very small. in the Indian case. There are people entering the waiting room. I suppose there's somebody else admitting them, so it doesn't show on my screen. Okay. Shall I just admit and so it doesn't disturb? Okay. The US far and away the highest, but other rich countries also showing very high per capita emissions by final demand. Okay, Japan, Germany, Russia, remember, it's a hydrocarbon exporter, so it still makes a big difference. But the UK, Japan, Germany now significantly high emitters relative to the much, much smaller contribution of even China and definitely India. Now, how do you actually reduce carbon emissions? You can reduce them through trade, or you can reduce them internally. And if you're looking at internally, then there are basically three ways. You can reduce the energy you use per unit of GDP, and that typically happens through changing the sectoral composition of the economy, that you shift from very energy intensive sectors, agriculture, manufacturing, certain kinds of services, like let's say, cryptocurrency mining and so on, to other services that require less energy. Or within a sector, you can have technological changes that you reduce the energy consumption per unit of output through different kinds of technical progress. Or within the sectors and in the economy as a whole, you can change the kind of energy you use from the more carbon emitting sources to the less carbon emitting sources. Okay. So what's the best would be renewables, solar and wind, followed by nuclear, which I haven't mentioned here because I'm very conflicted about nuclear. Then natural gas, then petroleum, and then coal. Coal being the worst, the most polluting, the most carbon emitting, the most dirty form of energy. So you can actually reduce your carbon emissions through all these three ways. You can change the sectoral composition, you can reduce energy intensity of output, and you can reduce the emissions intensity of energy. Okay. Just to give you some idea of how this varies across countries, as you can see, it's huge, the variation. The energy intensity varies hugely, and typically the poorer countries or the resource-intensive countries use more energy per unit of output, and they also use more, or they produce more emissions per unit of energy, typically, okay? But if you look at the reduction in the first 2 decades of this century, again, you see a lot of variation. Okay, you see pretty much every country has reduced energy intensity, but the reduction of emissions per unit of energy varies hugely. Okay, I'm sure Sabri and Erinch will share the slides later, so I'm not going to spend too much time letting you look at them. What's the broad message from this? First of all, that there's, for these countries especially, significant declines in the energy intensity of GDP. And this is because of both structural change and technological change. Both have occurred. But of course, still we find that, the poorer countries, the BRICS, have higher levels of emission intensity. And of course, those that rely heavily on hydrocarbon exports like Russia also have high levels of emission intensity. Even so, India, in terms of per capita, has the lowest level of per capita emissions. But in terms of declining emission intensity, there's a very wide variation. It's only 13% in Italy and nearly 40% in the UK. And you can do it in different ways. But what you find is that France, Italy, the UK, and the US reduced their share of the more carbon emitting energy sources. They moved to greener forms of energy. But Japan and India actually increased their reliance on brown energy. Let me show you here the last column on the right. You can see Japan, the emissions intensity of energy goes up by 6.4%. In India, it goes up by 2.4%. In Japan, that's because of the Fukushima nuclear disaster, which created a shift away from nuclear to fossil fuels, which, as I said, if you look at the ladder, nuclear is better than fossil fuels. And in India, it's because there's been greater energy use overall, but in general, there's been a shift, greater use of coal, because we have large coal reserves and it's been cheaper. One big reason for the fact that the poorer countries have both higher energy intensity and emissions intensity is because we don't get the frontline technologies for energy saving and emission reducing production. And so I cannot highlight enough the significance of the intellectual property regime globally and the resistance by rich country governments to technology transfer in these crucial areas. And this is, to me, is one of the major features of climate imperialism today. But then there's also cross-border trade, the external component, which I've already mentioned to you. And as we know, China is a big player in this. It's really the story in a way of the 2 decades. The China emerges as a major manufacturing exporter, huge increase, okay, more than 10 times by value and even more in volume terms over the first 2 decades of this century. And a very large share of the imports from China, especially in the rich countries, required more carbon intensive production. So, for example, non-electrical machinery and transport equipment, this is a very carbon intensive industry. And US imports from China of this sector increased by 7 or 8 times, okay, 8-fold increase in these. In fact, by 2015, imports from China alone were more than half of the carbon emission balance, that gray bar that I showed you, the final demand minus domestic production emissions. So there were more than half of that for the USA, nearly 2/3 for Japan, nearly half for Germany, 40% for the UK, etc. This is a process that is not just driven by advanced economies, but basically they're multinational companies. And it took off after China's WTO entry. So you can see it happening from 2002 onwards. Since 2010, it's been declining, although it still remains large, as I showed you. So it peaked around 2010, this use of more carbon emitting production in China, but it's been declining since then. What's interesting is that China's trade with developing countries and Russia shows the opposite balance. It actually shows a negative balance. So China is importing more carbon emitting stuff from Russia and from other developing countries. But of course, what's also very important is that emissions inequality within countries is significant and has got worse. Okay, so you have this is a very interesting table to my mind, and this is from the World Inequality Lab in Paris. Luca Chancel in that lab has been doing a lot of work specifically on carbon emissions inequality. And this is in terms of the per capita metric tons per year. And the year here is, I think, 2016. But what's really significant is that the rich, the top 10% in all regions except sub-Saharan Africa, the rich produce a lot of carbon emissions. And in general, they produce much more carbon emissions than even the bottom half of the population in the United States, in North America, and in Europe. And that's quite a striking result, okay? So first of all, North America is way ahead of the pack, driven by the US. I mean, it's crazy, right? And the top 10% of North America, it's off the charts emissions, 73 metric tons per capita. But the bottom half produces less than 10 metric tons. And that is almost 1/3 of what the richest in East Asia produce. 1/4 of what the richest in East Asia produce. Even the East Asian rich are they're hugely more. They're about 8 times more than what the bottom half in Europe produce in terms of emissions. So one important story is that the rich in every region, except in Africa, are responsible for a lot of the emissions. And another important story is that actually it's been declining for the poor. So there's an Oxfam report which tells us that between 1990 and 2015, the richest 10% of the world added 52% of carbon emissions. And that's extraordinary, right? That more than half of carbon emissions comes from just the richest 10% of the world. The latest report for Davos, which is yet to be released, but I've just seen in a draft copy, tells you that the top 1% is responsible for nearly 1/3 of the change in emissions since the pandemic. So the increased emissions since the pandemic, 1/3 of it comes from just the richest 1% of the world. And of course, in this larger, longer period, this richest 1% added 15% of emissions, more than all the citizens of the European Union and more than double the poorest half of humanity. Okay. In fact, as a result of that, what they estimate is that if you could bring the emissions of the top 10% of the world to just the EU average is 8 metric tons per capita, then you would cut global emissions by almost 1/3. Now, we know that annual emissions grew by 60% between 1990 and 2015, and more than 1/3 of that came from just the richest 5% of the world. Meanwhile, in the same period, the poorest half of the world has lower emissions. Just sort of let that thought sit with you for a minute. The poorest half of the world in every region, including in North America, including in Europe, their emissions fell. It's really the rich that are driving this, okay? Now, what we also know is that climate finance has been completely inadequate. That's the next aspect of the imperialism that I have mentioned. You're not going to be able to get either mitigation or adaptation of any meaningful amount without trillions and trillions of dollars required every year. There was a pathetic amount of 100 billion promised in 2012. Well, essentially as bilateral finance. It didn't say clearly bilateral, but rich countries pledged that they would give 100 billion in climate finance every year. What have they managed to produce? Well, the total is less than 80 billion throughout this period, but bilateral climate finance has been even pathetically smaller, between 22 and 29 billion, 32 billion. Just pathetic amounts. And a lot of that is really just, renaming existing projects and aid and so on. It's not new finance. A lot of that is just renaming. There's a study done by an Indian group, Jayaraman and others, and Tejal Kanitkar, which suggests that the additional new climate bilateral finance is not more than 5 or 6 billion. Now, contrast that with the trillions of dollars out of a hat that the rich countries were able to provide when they needed it during the pandemic. Okay, clearly there was no problem in finding money when they needed it. Okay, however, while there's no money for climate finance, there's still a lot of money for global fossil fuel subsidies. The usual number that is thrown around is 550 billion in terms of fossil fuel subsidies, but that is just the pure fiscal subsidy. How much is going out of a government budget? The IMF has estimated, if you count implicit subsidies as well, that's the left-hand chart. The explicit subsidies are the gray bars. The blue is the implicit subsidies. And what the IMF finds is that if you include implicit subsidies, which also includes a whole range of financial subsidies, not just pure tax rebates and straightforward, transfers, but various other kinds of underwriting of loans, de-risking of projects, cheaper access to credit, not taking into account other externalities of production, etc. If you count all of that, then you get a slightly larger number. You get 5.8 trillion per year. Not 550 billion, but 5.8 trillion. And the US alone stands at about 700 billion. In other words, extraordinary levels of subsidies still being provided to global fossil fuel industries. And this is before the Ukraine war. This is before the latest quite open shift back to fossil fuels among the G7 countries in the wake of the war. Can somebody just admit the people who are in the waiting room, because it's a bit of a distraction to keep seeing that message here. However,
we're taking care of it, Jayati. Just go ahead.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so however, while in fact there is inadequate finance, and there is inadequate access to technology and all of that, you often see in many of our countries, it's certainly the case in India, that the problem is posed as, that they are trying to prevent our development. The rich countries got rich on the basis of fossil fuels, and now they don't want to let us in. I would argue that that's a false dilemma. That's really the wrong way of going about it. And that, in fact, you don't need to follow exactly the same trajectory as the rich world. We can, because the technology exists, we can choose a development pattern that does those three things I mentioned, that we improve the level of energy efficiency of the economy, we change our patterns of investment and consumption towards activities that require less energy. Within the energy sources, we reduce the share of the most carbon emitting, coal and fossil fuel, to natural gas, to clean renewables and hydro and so on. Obviously, that means different urbanization patterns. It means different types of industrial strategy, and it means much more upfront investment. There is an estimate by my colleague Bob Polin and Noam Chomsky, which suggests that this can be done with about 1.5% of GDP of the large economies annually. There are other estimates that are a bit more expansive. The Club of Rome has produced a book recently called The Earth for All, which is based on a big simulation exercise. I am also one of the co-authors of that report. But there we estimate about 2.5% of global GDP will be required annually. Now, it seems like a lot, but frankly, it's not that much. We have seen huge increases during the pandemic of fiscal spending. Suddenly money was available, and it obviously can be done. So 1.5 to 2.5% of GDP is not some unthinkable amount. But of course, as I have mentioned, in addition to finance, you absolutely have to have access to technology. The thing is that, there are a number of concerns that with the current mitigation strategies. We know that cap and trade is not effective in reducing emissions. Basically, it just transfers the location of the emissions. We know that mitigation strategies themselves can be imperialist in their nature. There's a real problem with lithium, with rare earths, with all the mining that is required for the new resources that are required. Already we see resource grabs, we see the emergence of resource curses in lithium and rare earth producing countries, and really the absence of a global regulatory framework for any of this. Another example of supposedly good environmental strategies that don't necessarily end up being so good is in terms of recycling waste. Most waste from rich countries has been recycled by just exporting to the developing world. And there it is often dealt with in extremely hazardous conditions with lots of adverse environmental implications. It's only when China banned plastics import. China was one of the big plastic importers for recycling, and it banned them in 2016. And it's only then that the rich countries sat up and took notice. And when other countries also suggested that, well, we don't need to be doing this either. And therefore, there was a global plastics convention, and now there are moves towards a global plastic treaty. But it really needed a shock like that to force the rich countries to change their behavior. Because of the huge subsidies, because of the fact that carbon is still not priced properly in the sense of, in terms of its full impact, social impact, private financial markets are still incentivized to fund the dirty investments. And there's no regulation, there's no disincentive. And meanwhile, ESG was supposed to be the big solution. And most of it is now very clear is just greenwashing. It's just really a pretense. So clearly, we need national changes, and within every country, we need particular policy changes, but we also need changes in the international economic architecture. Because otherwise, currently, the current form of climate imperialism is actually leading us to planetary disaster. So first of all, you have to use market exchange rates, the actual existing exchange rates, to determine GDP, and not purchasing power parity exchange rates. That would reduce the climate obligations of poorer countries significantly. We have to bring in historical carbon debt and actually give responsibility also according to the past debt and consider what share you would get of a future carbon budget if you want to stay within 1.5 or 1.8 degrees, whatever. What should be the allocation of the available carbon budget? We need massively increased climate finance, but it should be based on global public investment principles, which is to say that every country contributes and then it's distributed according to need. It's not seen as foreign aid, which is a gift of donor countries to recipient countries in this very colonial pattern. Now, there's no doubt that we need a lot more private investment in green energy and in installing all the infrastructure required for, let's say, electric vehicles and stuff like that. And so definitely you need incentives for private investment and you need de-risking in many countries. There's no doubt about it. But the problem is that usually this is not accompanied by any conditionalities or regulations. And what we need now is for all incentives and de-risking to be accompanied by conditions that they must be along with social goals. They shouldn't just be putting all the money into share buyback. They should be performing as promised in the contracts that are specified. They should be subject to regulations so that, for example, if they get money for green investment, they should reduce their investments in brown energy accordingly. We need much more public finance. One possible route is expansion of SDRs. I know that Sabri has been thinking about this as well, but you could also think of a specific, it would require a change in the IMF articles, but basically a specific targeted expansion of SDRs in which the SDRs are only provided to certain countries. We could think of something like a global carbon fund. This is a proposal of Raghuram Rajan that is basically saying, well, let's say we have a global average per capita emissions, which is 4.5, I think, at the moment. So any countries that are emitting above that have to pay into a fund, and any countries that are emitting below that get money from that fund. So this operates as a kind of incentive. It forces countries to reduce or encourages them to reduce, and it provides some resources for countries that are below that. And so it operates on both levels. It operates as a market incentive or disincentive, and it also provides some resources. The famous climate finance that hasn't been forthcoming. And of course, you also have to not just give incentives to private finance, you have to regulate it. You have to control its direction. You have to say, well, if you're putting $1 into a brown energy product, you need to put $5 into green energy, or some other regulations along those lines. There's a lot of talk about border carbon taxes. The EU has already proposed it. The Biden administration is also thinking about it. I personally feel that it's a trade protectionist device, especially because principles of compensation and sharing of revenues are not clearly defined. They're most unlikely to be either clear or just. Any global tax and dividend policy would require trust and international cooperation. And we know that those don't exist at the moment. I have just described to you a very unequal and imperialistic world. But one thing that clearly needs to be done is to curb the carbon emissions of the wealthy. If the top 10% is responsible for all of these carbon emissions, prevent their consumption and their investment from the craziness that they are achieving. So ban certain kinds of very carbon emitting activities, private jets, frequent flights to the moon, SUVs. I mean, these are not necessary and can easily just be banned. But you could also tax them hugely, and you could tax the wealthy in general, actually introduce significant wealth taxes that would thereby also reduce their ability to fund and to engage in very carbon emitting activities. The World Bank and the other multilateral development banks, the regional banks, etc., really have to become green banks. But they need more capital, they need more resources, they need more ambition, they need significant restructuring. The international financial institutions in general need new governance and a change in the mode of operation. So the IMF also should not anymore be concerned solely with stabilization and adjustment, but it should also be thinking about ways to make liquidity available globally, just like domestic central banks can do. Technology, I've been talking about it a lot, but it's absolutely crucial. We have to make green technologies accessible to everyone. And so obviously we need to change the intellectual property regime. That means we have to renegotiate TRIPS. We also have to make sure that the green transition is just, not just for workers who would lose their jobs in the dirty industries, but for all of those who are impacted by the new resource grabs that I have mentioned. So this is what we need. Did we get any of this in COP27 in Egypt? Well, we got the acceptance in principle of loss and damage payments. Now, you could argue that accepting anything in principle also is a success, because we don't even get that anymore. But frankly, no money has been committed. The details are unclear. The amount is unclear. It's all supposed to be worked out by a committee. So we have no idea how that's going to go. There was only mention about phasing out fuel, not coal, not all fossil fuels. And that's actually a step back from Glasgow, when there was a statement about fossil fuels in general. All that is said is that they would remove or reduce inefficient subsidies on fossil fuels. No clear message on how those are defined, which ones are inefficient. So the chances are that this is just going to be a cop-out, that people will continue to give large subsidies and say, no, but these are efficient. Tiny pledges for adaptation finance, tiny relative to the kinds of things we're dealing with. To give you an idea, the estimated cost for dealing with loss and damage after the Pakistan floods is 42 billion. The total amount pledged at COP27 for adaptation finance is 230 million. And of course, there's nothing on mitigation finance. There's nothing on the fact that you didn't even meet the promises you have been making for so many years. And instead of saying that we'll meet those promises, you say we're going to set new collective quantified goal on climate finance in 2 years' time. So quite a lot of cop-out. So what's the conclusion? It's a bit of a depressing one, that, it's climate imperialism is alive and well, and it works as all imperialism does, both between countries and within countries, because it's big capital and the elites in all locations who benefit and reinforce the system. So the challenges are within countries and globally, and they're posed by entrenched patterns of production and consumption, by domestic inequalities, the power of elites, the rise of authoritarianism, and the fact that increasingly authoritarian governments use new technologies. But unfortunately, we can't wait for the big global revolution and all of that. We are facing very rapid climate change. It's an emergency. And so we cannot afford to wait for changes at any one level. We need to try and force change at every level in whichever way we can. That means we should be promoting national or regional strategies as well, even though, as I've said, we can't really do it until we revamp the global structures. Okay, thank you. I'm sorry it's gone on for longer because of that whole period when I was not around. So apologies for that.
No problem at all. Okay, now I guess we can start the questions and answers part. Özgür wants to ask a question.
Jayati, thank you very much for this. This was longer for you than for us. You had to speak a bit. And I really like pessimistic conclusions, so thank you for that as well. But you also talked about, you mentioned briefly the role of the intellectual property rights in this whole transition. I was wondering if you'd like to expand a little bit on that, because that's something that I've been spending a lot of time lately as well.
Yeah, I think what's happened now is that TRIPS has emerged as one of the biggest barriers. Okay, we saw attempts to do technology transfer from the Paris Agreement onwards. Most of those failed miserably. We now find that countries that try to implement new green technologies face all kinds of difficulties also because the technologies involved in the most efficient forms of renewable energy production require, many of these are patented. And unfortunately, they're patented not just by Europeans and North Americans, but the Chinese. And it's very hard to access. The Chinese haven't been any more generous than anyone else in providing access to the technologies. Now, this really means that it's doubly expensive in the developing world. It's not just that, finance is not interested because it cannot make sure that, the political climate is stable and all the usual stuff that they tell you. It's also that it just happens to be more expensive because you have to buy licenses. You have to buy the elements of the things that go into the solar panels and so on and so forth. You have to buy the elements of the batteries and all of those things at much higher prices because you cannot produce it yourself. So, and increasingly, it's evident that we also know that many of the carbon capture things are subject to major patents and industrial licenses, industrial design licenses, and so on. We know that green hydrogen, which is seen as one of the possibilities for the future, also subject to massive intellectual property control. We really have to bring in major waivers under the TRIPS agreement for for technologies that affect the planet. Just like we should have had a TRIPS waiver for the COVID vaccines, which we didn't get until it wasn't relevant anymore. Similarly, we must from now insist on a TRIPS waiver for technologies that are necessary for coping with the planet.
So I was wondering, are you just talking about the IPRs on renewable energy investments, or also like other types of investments to reduce like the energy intensity of production and stuff like that?
Well, some of those are already routinized. Okay. A large part, that's one of the reasons why pretty much most countries have reduced energy intensity of production. Many of the things which, some of it is sectoral, as I mentioned, but within sectors, many of the things that make you less reliant on energy per unit are more widely disseminated. They're already more routinized. The things that are not routinized are the green energy things. And particularly, for example, electric vehicles and all of the infrastructure related to electric vehicles. That's all still very much in the domain of control of knowledge, still private control of knowledge. And it's not something, and yet if you really want to get that transition, you will have to electrify everything, and you will have to electrify based on renewables. And so you will need that more and more.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Well, if there is no one else raising hand, then actually I have a question, Jayati.
Yes.
Yeah.
Indeed,
yeah. Okay. We all know that central banks of major countries, advanced economies, if you like, are capable of injecting liquidity. Technically speaking, in other words, they are able to create money for various purposes. Whereas when we look at those banks, so-called banks, who are supposed to, multilateral banks, such as World Bank and other development banks, actually they are banks only in the name, in the sense that they are not capable of creating money. What they are doing is essentially issuing bonds to raise funds and then lending those money that they collect for whatever purposes. The only institution that can create money, more like the central banks, is International Monetary Fund, and interestingly, its name is not a bank, right?
Yes.
Yeah, World Bank is not a bank, actually, right? It's just issuing bonds and then raising funds and lending those.
Keynes had said that. Keynes said that. Keynes said the bank is actually a fund and the fund is actually a bank.
Precisely. The fund is a bank, and the bank is a fund, actually. So why don't we allow these institutions to inject liquidity in the way the central banks of the US, the UK, Japan, and all can inject all the money that they pumped into their economies with the COVID pandemic, and even after the 2008 global financial crisis. I mean, if they are capable of doing these, why don't we allow these development banks as well as World Bank to create liquidity for such purposes to spend on climate investments? Is there, since you are connected to these guys, I mean, you are among them discussing
this is one of this is a recommendation that we have actually seriously discussed, and I hope will be in the final report. We are recommending an issue of special SDRs, but this requires a changing the articles of the fund. Okay, the SDRs normally are automatically just given to all countries that are members according to quota. What we have suggested is periodic issue of special SDRs for specific climate fund related or global health challenge related expenditures.
Yeah, so it's the IMF that's going to do in your proposal,
right.
I suppose.
Yes.
Well, it has the powers to create the SDRs. If the articles are changed, then that can be done, right?
No, it's just a question of distributing. We're saying don't bother giving it according to quota, because anyway, 60% of it will go to rich countries who will never use it.
Yeah, I know.
So in fact, you don't create $650 billion worth of SDRs, create $200 billion and distribute it only to specific countries.
Yeah.
LMICs facing climate threat, small island economies, those that have experienced climate disasters, etc.
Yeah, and furthermore, IMF can fund these development banks. There are 11 or 12 of them, if I'm not wrong.
In fact, they could do that even now. They could actually, because the MDBs are empowered to hold SDRs. Very few institutions are empowered.
Yeah,
the
they
MDBs
have a
are
concept.
empowered. Yes.
Yeah,
but it would require the US and Europe to say yes, and so far they have said no. So far they have said no.
Forget about Europe. US by itself, it has the 16.5% voting power. If it says no, it's a veto for all practical purposes, right? It can't stop it. And there is no way to convince them, I guess, huh?
So far not. So far not. I'm told that Kristalina Georgieva is trying. I can tell you though, I thought, we have always been so critical of the IMF and Washington, D.C. and the Bretton Woods institutions in general and so on. I was on there's a House Committee on Financial Services where they had a hearing, and I was on a hearing for them. Some of those Republican senators are crazy. I mean, they hate the IMF from the right. They think the IMF is crazy because it's funding all these corrupt countries, and Kristalina Georgieva is corrupt, and we shouldn't give them any money. The whole thing should be thrown into the sea. They're coming from another place altogether. And that's a very large political tendency in the US.
Yeah, well, apparently these guys are not aware of the potential problems. Forget about potential problems. They're already happening. Yeah. I mean, as you were explaining, if we do not act now, it's going to get worse every other day. And we don't do anything about it. It's sad. I don't know what else to say. Sad is to soft,
this is apparently the 9th. California is having a drought for the 9th year in a row. California produces 50% of the US horticultural products. And even that doesn't get them going. I don't know what gets them going.
What happened to your works in this ICRIT for taxing corporation?
Well, we're still at it. We still keep trying. There's going to be a big conference, in fact, in New York, which I'm hoping. Well, no, it starts on the 30th and the 1st.
No, I won't be there. So we are not able to collect taxes to spend on climate either.
Yeah, that's right. And again, this is low-hanging fruit, right? There's so many easy things you could do to enable more tax collection and to stop illicit financial flows. Yeah.
Oh yeah, well, it's all about willingness, I guess, but they don't show that willingness, unfortunately. The ones who are in power, unfortunately. Anyway, is there any other question? Huh? Doesn't look so.
This was one of those presentations that was so clear and so to the point that, that doesn't leave a lot of questions, I guess.
That's very nice of you. There could be another interpretation that I put everybody to sleep so they don't have any questions.
Oh, that's well, at least I'm a counterexample. So your statement is false. If you find a counterexample
on the board.
You say, as a mathematician, I know how to disprove some statements. Yeah. Anyway, if there is no other question, then I guess we thank you a lot, Jayati. We hope to see you again, both in the virtual space as well as in the real world. When I am in New York, I'll try to come to Amherst for that meeting that you have on the 3rd.
And meanwhile, lots of solidarity from all of us in India. We're struggling with similar forces everywhere. So
yeah, unfortunately.
Likewise, yeah.
Yeah.
Best of luck to all of us, I guess.
Yes,
I should
exactly. Okay, thanks a lot.
Thank you, Jayati. Bye.
Many thanks, Jayati.
Hey, Josh, someone has a question, I guess.